Alright, picking back up with Napoleon's The Art of War and Power, Maxim 8. A general-in-chief should ask himself frequently in the day, what should I do if the enemy's army appeared now in my front or in my right or my left? If he have any difficulty in answering these questions, his position is bad and he should seek to remedy it. There's a picture here, captioned, Before Napoleon, Maurice de Saxe, Marshal of France, 1696 through 1750, was the most successful French general of the 18th century. Note, in the campaign of 1758, the position of the Prussian army at Hohenkirch, being commanded by the batteries of the enemy who occupied all the heights, was eminently defective, notwithstanding Frederick, who saw his rear menaced by the corps of Loudon, remained 6 days in his camp without seeking to correct his position. It would seem, indeed, that he was ignorant of his real danger, for Marshal Daun, having maneuvered during the night in order to attack by daybreak, surprised the Prussians in their lines before they were able to defend themselves, and by this means surrounded them completely. Frederick succeeded, however, in effecting his retreat with regularity, but not without the loss of 10,000 men, many general officers, and almost all of his artillery. If Marshal Daun had followed up his victory with greater boldness, the King of Prussia would never have been able to rally his army. On this occasion, Frederick's good fortune balanced his imprudence. Marshal Saxe remarks that there is more talent than is dreamt of in bad dispositions, if we possess the art of converting them into good ones when the favorable moment arrives. Nothing astonishes the enemy so much as this maneuver. He has counted upon something. All his arrangements have been founded upon it accordingly, and at the moment of attack it escapes him. I must repeat, says the Marshal, there is nothing that so completely disconcerts an enemy as this, or leads him to commit so many errors, for it follows that if he does not change his arrangements, he is beaten, and if he does change them in presence of his adversary, he is equally undone. It seems to me, however, that a general who should rest the success of a battle upon such a principle would be more likely to lose than to gain by it, for if he had to deal with a skillful adversary and an alert tactician, the latter would find time to take advantage of the previous bad arrangements before he would be able to remedy them. Maxim 9. The strength of an army, like the power in mechanics, is estimated by multiplying the mass of the rapidity. A rapid march augments the morale of an army and increases its means of victory. Press on. Note, rapidity, says Montecuccoli, is of importance in concealing the movements of an army, because it leaves no time to divulge the intention of its chief. It is therefore an advantage to attack the enemy unexpectedly, to take him off his guard, to surprise him and let him feel the thunder before he sees the flash. But if too great celerity exhausts your troops, while on the other hand, delay deprives you of the favorable moment when you must weigh the advantage against the disadvantage and choose between. Marshal Villars observes that in war everything depends upon being able to deceive the enemy, and having once gained this point, in never allowing him time to recover himself. Villars has united practice to precept. His bold and rapid marches were almost always crowned with success. It was the opinion of Frederick that all wars should be short and rapid, because a long war insensibly relaxes discipline, depopulates the state, and exhausts its resources. Facing page. The charge of the French cuirassiers at Friedland, painted by Ernest Maisonnier. Oh, man. Meissonier. In 1807, at the Battle of Friedland, now Provdinsk, Russia, Napoleon's Grand Army decisively defeated the Russian army under Tsar Alexander I. Maxim 10. When an army is inferior in number, inferior in cavalry and in artillery, it is essential to avoid a general action. The first deficiency should be supplied by rapidity of movement, the want of artillery by the nature of maneuvers, and the inferiority in cavalry by the choice of positions. In such circumstances, the morale of the soldier does much. Note: the campaign of 1814 in France was skillfully executed upon these principles. Napoleon, with an army inferior in number, an army discouraged by the disastrous retreats of Moscow and of Leipzig, and still more by the presence of the enemy in French territory, contrived, notwithstanding, to supply his vast inequality of force by the rapidity and combination of his movements. By the success obtained at Champaubert, Montmirail, Montereau, and Reims, I believe, he began to restore the morale of the French army. The numerous recruits of which it was composed had already acquired that steadiness of which the old regiments afforded them an example. When the capture of Paris and the astonishing revolution it produced compelled Napoleon to lay down his arms. But this consequence resulted rather from the force of circumstances than from any absolute necessity. For Napoleon, by carrying his army to the other side of the Loire, might easily have formed a junction with the armies of the Alps and Pyrenees and have reappeared on the field of battle at the head of 100,000 men. Such a force would have amply sufficed to re-establish the chances of war in his favor, more especially as the armies of the allied sovereigns were obliged to maneuver upon the French territory with all the strong places of Italy and France in the rear. Facing page. Napoleon's triumphal march through Berlin on 27th of October 1806 during the French occupation of Prussia. From there, he advanced into East Prussia and Poland. By the end of 1807, Napoleon had gained control of almost all of Western and Central Europe except for Spain, Portugal, Austria, and a few smaller states. Maxim 11. To direct operations with lines far removed from each other and without communications is to commit a fault which always gives birth to a second. The detached column has only its orders for the first day. Its operations on the following day depend on what may have happened to the main body. Thus, this column either loses time upon emergency in waiting for orders, or it will act without them, and at hazard. Let it therefore be held as a principle that an army should always keep its columns so united as to prevent the enemy from passing between them with impunity. Whenever, for particular reasons, this principle is departed from, the detached corps should be independent in their operations. They should move toward a point fixed upon for their future junction. They should advance without hesitating and without waiting for fresh orders, and every precaution should be taken to prevent an attack upon them in detail. Note: the Austrian army, commanded by Field Marshal Alvinzi, was divided into two corps destined to act independently until they should accomplish their junction before Mantua. The first of these corps, consisting of 45,000 men, was under the orders of Alvinzi. It was to debauch. Footnote for debauch. March out from a confined place into open country. Debauch. By Monte Baldo, upon the positions occupied by the French army on the Adige. The second corps, commanded by General Prevera, was destined to act upon the lower Adige and to raise the blockade of Mantua. Napoleon, informed of the enemy's movements but not entirely comprehending his projects, confined himself to concentrating his masses and giving orders to the troops to hold themselves in readiness to maneuver. Underneath the painting here, at the start of Battle of Rivoli on 14th of January 1797, the French were badly outnumbered, but Napoleon's ability to move forces rapidly to the battlefield and the tactical superiority of the French troops led to a decisive victory that would finally make Napoleon master of Italy. In the meantime, fresh information satisfied the general-in-chief of the French army that the corps which had debouched by La Corona over Monte Baldo was endeavoring to form a junction with its cavalry and artillery, both which, having crossed the Adige at Dolce, were directing their march upon the plateau of Rivoli, by the great road leading by Incanole. Napoleon immediately foresaw that by having possession of the plateau, he should be able to prevent this junction and obtain all advantages of the initiative. He accordingly put his troops in motion and at 2 o'clock in the morning occupied that important position. He repulsed every attack, made 7,000 prisoners, and took several standards and 12 pieces of cannon. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Battle of Rivoli was already gained when Napoleon, learning that General Provera had passed the Adige at Anghiari, and was directing his march upon Mantua, left to his generals the charge of following up the retreat of Alvinzi, and placed himself at the head of a division for the purpose of defeating the designs of Provera. By a rapid march, he again succeeded in the initiatory movement and in preventing the garrison of Mantua from uniting its force with the relieving army. The corps entrusted with the blockade, eager to distinguish itself under the eyes of the conqueror of Rivoli, compelled the garrison to retire into the place, while the division of Victor, forgetting the fatigues of a forced march, rushed with impetuosity on the relieving army in front. At this moment a sortie from the lines of St. George took him in flank, while the corps of Augereau, which had followed the march of the Austrian general, attacked him in rear. Provera, surrounded on all sides, capitulated. The result of these two battles cost the Austrians 3,000 men in killed and wounded, 22,000 prisoners, 24 standards, and 46 pieces of cannon. Maxim 11. An army ought to have only one line of operation. This should be preserved with care and never abandoned but in the last extremity. Note: the line of communication of an army, says Montecuccoli, must be certain and well established. For every army that acts from a distant base, and is not careful to keep this line perfectly open, marches upon a precipice. It moves to certain ruin, as may be seen by an infinity of examples. In fact, if the road by which provisions, ammunition, and reinforcements are to be brought up is not entirely secured, if the magazines, the hospitals, the depots of arms, and the places of supply are not fixed and commodiously situated, not only the army cannot keep the field, but it will be exposed to the greatest dangers. Maxim 13. The distances permitted between corps of an army upon the march must be governed by the localities, by circumstances, and by the object in view. Really cool painting here. Note: when an army moves at a distance from the enemy, the columns may be disposed along the road so as to favor the artillery and baggage. But when it is marching into action, the different corps must be formed in close columns in order of battle. The generals must take care that the heads of the columns, which are to attack together, do not outstep each other, and that in approaching the field of action they preserve the relative intervals required for deployment. The marches that are made preparatory to a battle require, says Frederick, the greatest precaution. With this view, he recommends his generals to be particularly on their guard and to reconnoiter the ground at successive distances in order to secure the initiative by occupying those positions most calculated to favor an attack. On a retreat, it is the opinion of many generals that an army should concentrate its forces and march in close columns if it is still strong enough to resume the offensive, for by this means it is easy to form the line when a favorable opportunity presents itself, either for holding the enemy in check or for attacking him if he is not in a situation to accept battle. Facing page: Vasily Surakov's 1899 painting of Russian troops crossing the Alps in 1799, led by the celebrated General Alexander Suvorov, who went on to write rules for the conduct of military actions in the mountains. Numerous 19th century paintings commemorate this extraordinarily courageous attempt to conquer the elements. Such was Murat's retreat after the passage of the Adda by the Austro-Russian army. The French general, after having covered the evacuation of Milan, took up a position between the Po and the Tanaro. His camp rested upon Alexandria and Valentia, two capital fortresses, and had the advantage of covering the roads to Turin and Savona, by which he could effect his retreat in case he was unable to accomplish a junction with the Corps d'Armée of MacDonald, who had been ordered to quit the kingdom of Naples, and hasten his march into Tuscany. Forced to abandon his position in consequence of the insurrection in Piedmont and Tuscany, Murat retired upon Asti, where he learned that his communication with the river of Genoa had just been cut off by the capture of Seba. After several ineffectual attempts to retake this place, he saw that his only safety depended upon throwing himself into the mountains. To effect this object, he directed the whole of his battering train and heavy baggage by the Col des Fenestrelles upon France. Then, opening himself a way over the St. Bernard, he gained Loano with his light artillery and the small proportion of field equipment he had been able to preserve. By this skillful movement he had only retained his communications with France, but he was enabled to observe the motions of the army from Naples and to facilitate his junction with it by directing the whole of his force upon the points necessary for that purpose. MacDonald, in the meantime, whose only chance of success depended on concentrating his little army, neglected this precaution and was beaten in 3 successive actions at the Trebia. By this retardment of his march, he rendered all Morau's measures to unite the 2 armies in the plans of the Po useless, and his retreat, after his brilliant but fruitless efforts at the Trebia, defeated the other arrangements also which the former had made to come to his support. The inactivity of Marshal Suwarrow, however, finally enabled the French general to accomplish his junction with the remains of the army from Naples. Morau then concentrated his whole force upon the Apennines, and placed himself in a situation to defend the important positions of Liguria, until the chances of war should afford him an opportunity of resuming the offensive. When, after a decisive battle, an army has lost its artillery and equipments and is consequently no longer in a state to assume the offensive, or even to arrest the pursuit of the enemy, it would seem most desirable to divide what remains into several corps, and order them to march by separate and distant routes upon the base of operation and throw themselves into the fortresses. This is the only means of safety, for the enemy, uncertain as to the precise direction taken by the vanquished army, is ignorant in the first instance which corps to pursue, and it is in this moment of indecision that a march is gained upon him, besides the movements of a small body being so much easier than those of a larger one. These separate lines of march are all in favor of a retreating army. Maxim 14. Among mountains there are everywhere numerous positions extremely strong by nature, which you should abstain from attacking. The character of this mode of warfare consists in occupying camps on the flanks or in the rear of the enemy, leaving him only the alternative of abandoning his position without fighting, to take up another in the rear, or to descend from it in order to attack you. In mountain warfare the assailant has always the disadvantage. Even in offensive warfare in the open field, the great secret consists in defensive combats and in obliging the enemy to attack. Note, during the campaign of 1793, in the Maritime Alps, the French army under the orders of General Brunet did all in its power to get possession of the camps at Reus and at Forches by an attack in front, but these useless efforts served only to increase the courage of the Piedmontese, and to destroy the elite of the grenadiers of the Republican army. The maneuvers by which Napoleon, without fighting, compelled the enemy to evacuate these positions in 1796 suffice to establish the truth of these principles and to prove how much success in war depends upon the genius of the general as well as on the courage of the soldier. Facing page. In his painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps, Paul de la Roche presented a more realistic interpretation of the event than Jacques Louis David's dramatic Napoleon at the St. Bernard Pass. See page 2. Yeah, the one painting that Napoleon's best known for, and is actually the cover of the book. Maxim 15, and this will probably be the last one before we end this recording. The first consideration with a general who offers battle should be the glory and honor of his arms. The safety and preservation of his men is only the second, but it is the enterprise and courage resulting from the former that the latter will most assuredly be found. In a retreat, besides the honor of the army, the loss of life is often greater than in 2 battles. For this reason we should never despair, while brave men are to be found with their colors. It is by this means that we obtain victory and deserve to obtain it. Note, in 1645 the French army, under the orders of the Prince of Condé, was on the march to lay siege to Nordlingen, when it was discovered that Count Murci, who commanded the Bavarians, had foreseen this intention and had entrenched himself in a strong position which defended Nordlingen at the same time that it covered Donauwörth. Notwithstanding the favorable position of the enemy, Condé ordered the attack. The combat was terrible. All the infantry in the center and on the right, after being successfully engaged, was routed and dispersed in spite of the efforts of the cavalry and the reserve, which were likewise carried away with the fugitives. The battle was lost. Condé, in despair, having no longer either center or right to depend upon, collected the remnants of his battalions and directed his march to the left, where Turenne was still engaged. This perseverance reanimated the ardor of the troops. They broke the right wing of the enemy, and Turenne, by a change of front, returned to the attack upon his center. Night, too, favored the boldness of Condé. An entire corps of Bavarians, fancying themselves cut off, laid down their arms, and the obstinacy of the French general in this struggle for victory was repaid by possession of the field of battle, together with a great number of prisoners and almost all the enemy's artillery. The Bavarian army beat a retreat, and the next day Nordlingen capitulated. And that'll do it for this recording.